Hello, welcome to The Moment. This is the last episode of 2017, so there won't be a new one until sometime in January, but I'll update my Facebook nearer the time to let you know when the next show will be. This time I have a story about a new afforestisation effort in Northumberland, and I'll be talking about a Home Office report into mental health in the workplace. So let's look at the first story. A huge tree planting scheme at Doddington has been approved. The plan, headed by Andy Howard, project manager for Doddington, will see more than 600,000 trees planted on Doddington North Moor in Northumberland. According to the North Forest website, quote, "The Doddington site near Wooler is 354 hectares, with 268 hectares to be planted, 42% conifers, 20% native woodland, and 13% mixed Scots pine and native broadleaf. Of the remaining 25%, 10% is open ground and 15% managed priority habitat." David Lee from the not-for-profit forestry lobbying group known as Confer wrote an article on their website about the project, saying, quote, "There are positive benefits for biodiversity. The scheme will extend one of the region's red squirrel buffer zones and for flood mitigation. There is a lack of detailed empirical evidence about how such upland planting schemes impact on water quality and water flow in the river catchment below, and there have been positive noises from the Environment Agency and Forestry Commission for England about using Doddington as a test bed. The planting scheme would also be very useful for employment in the forestry industry, especially the local sawmill A&J Scott. Now, the mention of forestry having a role in flood mitigation is something that has actually been explored in a paper by Charlie Stratford et al. From the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. The paper in question was issued on the 7th of August this year and was carried out in collaboration with Forest Research, the National Farmers Union, the Environment Agency, Lancaster University, and others. In the introduction to the paper, they say, quote, "It is generally accepted that forests can influence rainfall-generated flooding through the mechanisms of interception, infiltration into the soils, and increasing available storage. Factors such as forest type, forest age, catchment size, and management regimes are likely, therefore, to influence the hydrological response." The executive summary explains the aim of the paper and its sources, saying, quote, "This review sought to capture qualitative findings from peer-reviewed studies focusing on the impact of trees and river flooding." Section 2.2 explains in more detail, quote, "The overarching aim was to assess the influence of trees on river floods in catchments in the UK or comparable climates to those of the UK. Trees can influence floods characteristics in a variety of ways, such as delaying the flood peak and extending the duration of high water level conditions. However, this review looks specifically at the influence of trees on peak flows, often measured as maximum discharge and measured in cubic meters of water per second." Their initial search turned up 19,337 results, but after screening this came down to 72 usable results. They then extracted qualitative statements from these papers and split them into two different sections based on whether they pertain to increasing or decreasing tree cover. There ended up being a significant amount of statements in all, 85, and there was a split of 53 statements regarding increasing tree cover and 32 regarding decreasing tree cover. So with regards to increasing tree cover, the charts show that 36 of the 53 statements said that increasing tree cover would decrease the flood peak, 5 said that it would have an increase, and 12 found that it would have no effect. With regards to a decreased number of trees, the opposite is true. No results said that it would actually decrease flood peaks. 21 said that it would increase them, and 11 said that it would have no effect. However, many of the results of these papers that this review looked at were based on models rather than observed data, and they say, quote, "With a distinction between observational and modelled results, it becomes apparent that the conclusion is less clear. The majority of the statements supporting both the relationship between increasing tree cover and decreased flood peaks and decreasing tree cover and increased flood peaks are based on model outputs. If the observational results are considered in isolation, the results of the analysis indicate that the relationship between increasing tree cover and flow is not significant, and the effect of increasing cover it was randomly distributed across the peak flow categories. For decreasing tree cover, there is a significant difference between categories of influence on flood peaks, arising largely as a result of the lack of recorded statements for peak flow decrease. However, the number of observation-based statements reporting a flow increase due to decreasing cover was similar to the number reporting no influence, and it was not possible to reach a clear conclusion on this basis. They then did a similar analysis, but this time they looked at the magnitude of the flood in each case, distinguished as general, large or small-scale floods. Again, they found that modelled results were dominant, but they say, quote, "Considering observed and modelled studies together, all statements relating to the effects of increasing cover on small events report a decrease in flood peak, whilst for large events the majority of statements indicate no influence, with a smaller number reporting a decrease. The results for decreasing cover are similar in that the majority of statements relating to small events report an increase in flood peak, whereas for large events the majority of statements indicate no influence." Again, they found that the results become less conclusive when the modelled studies were taken out of the equation. As they say further down in the concluding remarks, these new findings help to explain why there is so much debate associated with this topic and how it is possible for differing views on the influence of trees on peak flows to exist. Clearly, this is an area of research that requires a lot more observed data, probably collected over several more years, before anything approaching a conclusion can be found. In any case, the new afforestation efforts in Doddington will be a useful environment for wildlife and will provide jobs for local industries, but its role as a flood defence is definitely questionable. So now let's move on to the final story. The Home Office has published a report into mental health in the workplace. The report, called Thriving at Work, looks at how employers can support the mental health needs of their employees, as well as finding good practices that could be taken up by employers around the country. Now, the report begins by making it clear that mental health issues aren't only the dramatic crippling disorders, but they can also be things like anxiety, stress and depression, which are far more prevalent. Section 2 uses figures from the Government Economic Service to quantify the scale of the issue. They say, quote, "Around 15% of those in work in England have symptoms of a mental health problem. Individuals with long-term mental health conditions are still far less likely to be in work than those without any health conditions or those with a physical health condition. Furthermore, our analysis has shown that those with a long-term mental health condition lose their jobs every year at around double the rate of those without a mental health condition, and at a much higher rate than those with a physical health condition." They then show the percentages of people who leave employment per quarter with no long-term mental health conditions, around 3%, who leave with constant long-term physical conditions, around 4%, and those who leave with constant long-term mental health conditions, around 6%. They identify a number of ways in which people with poor mental health tend to react to the problem. The first is sickness absence, where they say, quote, "While the overall rate of sickness absence has fallen by 15 to 20% since 2009, absence due to mental health reasons has actually risen by around 5%. People with a mental health condition are also 3 times more likely to have a long-term period of sickness." On the complete flip side of this, presenteeism is also a problem. Quote, presenteeism is defined as showing up to work when one is ill, resulting in a loss of productivity and sometimes making an individual's condition worse. Whilst the percentage of days off due to any type of illness is around 25% lower than a decade ago, various studies suggest that presenteeism is increasing year on year. So Section 3 of the report looks at the financial costs to employers that mental health problems account for. They say, poor mental health costs employers between £33 billion and £42 billion a year, though they do put a caveat here that these numbers are rounded to the nearest billion. They continue, this is made up of $8 billion in absentee costs, plus $17 to $26 billion in presenteeism costs, plus $8 billion in staff turnover. This amounts to a cost per employee of between £1,205 and £1,560 per year. This cost is for all employees, not just those who are ill. Again, they do say here that there is uncertainty at the exact cost of presenteeism, but that even conservative estimates would be quite large. They then break down the private sector mental health costs per employee and give a high and low estimate for each section. The lowest mental health costs are in the hotels, catering and leisure industries at £932 or £497 per employee for high and low estimates respectively. At the top are finance, insurance and real estate industries with a low estimate of £2,017 and a high estimate of £2,564. These cost figures were all taken from a paper written by Deloitte, which is a financial advisory company, and more information can be found in that report, which I'll link in the description, along with this Home Office report if you want to go into more detail. They also estimate that the cost to the government to be around 24 to 27 billion, made up of 10 billion in benefits, 11 to 14 billion in lost tax/national insurance revenue, and 3 billion in NHS costs. Again, these are only rounded figures, but they do give some idea of the scale of the cost. Section 5 is where they give their recommendations for employers. At the top of the section, they say, quote, many employers know that they are missing opportunities to intervene early when employees are struggling, as the stigma of disclosing a mental health condition is still a significant barrier to employees seeking support. Further down, they propose something called the Mental Health Core Standards, which are 6 things that they believe employers can and should do to help. These are things like produce, implement and communicate a mental health at work plan that promotes good mental health of all employees and outlines the support available to those who need it. Develop mental health awareness among employees by making information, tools and support accessible. Encourage open conversations about mental health and the support available when employees are struggling. During the recruitment process and at regular intervals throughout employment, offer appropriate workplace adjustments to employees who require them. Provide employees with good working conditions and ensure they have a healthy work-life balance and opportunities for developments. Promote effective people management to ensure all employees have a regular conversation about their health and well-being with their line manager, supervisor, or organizational leader, and train and support line managers and supervisors in effective management practices. They then go on to talk about enhanced standards and say that they would want the public and private sectors to adopt these standards long term. These are increased transparency and accountability through internal and external reporting to include a leadership commitment and outline of the organization's approach to mental health. Demonstrate accountability by nominating a health and well-being lead at board or senior leadership level with clear reporting duties and responsibilities. Improve the disclosure process to encourage openness during recruitment and throughout, ensuring employees are aware of why the information is needed and make sure the right support is in place to facilitate a good employer response following disclosure. At the end of the section, they say, if appropriate measures are put in place from day one, and there is a culture where both employee and employer can be open to discussing potential challenges and options, this can reduce fears for both the employee and employer. Section 7 goes on to talk about how implementing these standards doesn't have to come down to just the employers alone, but that industry groups and trade unions can take on development of their own approaches to mental health. The report continues from there, but those are really the main points that it looks at, and overall I think this is a potentially good idea. They concede that different organisations operate differently, and so their approaches should be tailored to the workplace first, which is definitely a good thing. They also think that it will take about 10 years to fully implement those standards and train workplace leaders in implementing them. So this is obviously a long-term project, but one that could be very useful. And that's all for this episode. Join me in the new year for more from around Northumberland and Newcastle. I hope you have a good Christmas, and until we see each other again, I'm Oliver Ralph, and this is The Moment.